My honor to welcome you to the 47th Annual DC History Conference on behalf of the Conference Planning Committee. So imagine yourself in a digital room with more than 280 other researchers, scholars, students, and otherwise lovers of DC history. And if we were to be all together, you can just imagine the energy and the crackling excitement that would be in the room just now. So today we gather virtually. So as you settle down to your computer from the comfort of your home, maybe you've grabbed a cup of tea or a glass of wine, let me dispatch just a few housekeeping and logistical items. So my primary concern is to make sure that you can access the conference without glitches. So here are some key pieces of information. So you will be joining us using the same link each day. If you registered at the all access or supporter level, you should have received separate instructions to access additional programming. So please look for that email in your inbox. Sessions will be in one continuous stream on Friday. So basically that means that the panels will be on one day-long Zoom session. So once you've joined, you can keep the window open all day long. Friday sessions start at 9 a.m. with the opening plenary, capturing the moment, making history relevant. This program will feature Dr. Melanie Adams, director of the Anacostia Community Museum, in conversation with Dr. Izetta Autumn Mobley. You can also join the conversation on social media at #DCHistCon, that's HISTCON. And you will find poster sessions, the History Network, and Scholar Spotlight on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So please feel free to access your program for more information about that content as well. Needless to say, the DC History Conference is a team effort. It is one important way in which all organizations committed and devoted to the work of DC history gather, share resources, and support one another. This year, the Conference Planning Committee had the new challenge of creating a virtual conference with very little previous experience doing so. So with our co-presenter, American University, I sincerely thank the committee for their thoughtful work to pull together a compressed but dynamic program suitable to this new medium. So they are, I want to call them out, Mark Bembo, Kimberly Bender, Hannah Byrne, Mark Greek, our very own Karen Harris, Juliana Jackson, Rebecca Katz, Lily Liu, Izetta Autumn Mobley, MJ Rimza Pavlovska, Ruth Trocoli, and Lisa Warwick. We are also very grateful for the sponsors who are willing to make this leap of faith with us. I'm especially appreciative of the DC Preservation League and Humanities DC. One of my board members, St. Elmo Crawford, also stepped up at a crucial moment facilitating the conference's technology. His firm, Digital Conventions, deserves a very special shout out. Last but not least, the Conference Planning Committee recognizes the extraordinary work of our conference manager, Maren Orchard. I suggest that you remember this name because Maren is bound for greatness in our field, and it's been a pleasure to see her thrive in this role, and we would quite simply not be here without her. With the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Lecture, we honor the memory of this singular historian and educator who brought her intellect and tenacity to colleagues and students at Howard University and George Washington University during the pivotal 1960s and 1970s. She was born in Tuskegee, Alabama in October 1915 to a family with deep roots at the Tuskegee Institute. Dr. Brown received a Bachelor in Science from Tuskegee, taught grade school in Alabama, and went on to graduate studies at Ohio State University and Harvard University. Dr. Brown's dissertation centered on free and enslaved African Americans in DC. After completing her PhD in history at Harvard in 1966, she taught at Howard University, and no doubt she would have been very proud of our new vice president-elect. Dr. Brown was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship and in 1971 joined the faculty of George Washington University, where she remained until her untimely passing in 1976. I sincerely thank the Letitia Woods Brown family for their continued and extremely gracious support of the DC History Conference and this memorial lecture. We aim to do you proud. Before I introduce Dr. Summers, I must acknowledge what an extraordinary year this has been for the field of public history. The purpose of a conference like this is to bridge the gap between academic scholars pursuing new research and new areas of inquiry and the broader community of Washington area residents and history lovers. Together, thanks to this annual conference, we can all access exciting ideas and approaches that illuminate the district and its past. At the same time, 2020 has elevated the role academic and public historians play in explaining why we experience such profound levels of injustice and inequality in our community. At the DC History Center, we have felt a very special calling to be in conversation with a broad community of researchers, scholars, community leaders and activists, teachers and students around the legacy of historic racism and the resiliency of people of color. As an example of this work, the most recent issue of Washington History, and perhaps some of you already have this on your coffee table, features 29 diverse scholars reflecting on the events of this year through the lens of their research. And like this conference, the magazine seeks to bring us together by sharing insight, provoking dialogue, and spurring us to civic action. In another instance, next week, on November 18th, we host a Zoom conversation titled White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes, reflecting on DC's freeway fight. This program will highlight a successful instance of grassroots community organizing and a veteran from this fight, Samuel Jordan. Breaking down barriers in our community will take all of us, all contributing our strengths and special talents to bringing about the change we want to see. The DC History Center, as one of the city's oldest civic institutions, has much more work to do in advancing the cause of justice. So as 2020 comes to a close, I make the simple acknowledgement that we are aware of the indigenous nations on whose land we stand, the labor of the enslaved people who worked on that land, and the continued legacies of inequity. Our organization is challenged to change and grow. We don't have all the answers yet, but we are committed to a process of self-examination and community-oriented action. You'll see more of the results of that work in the months ahead. Now allow me to introduce Dr. Summers. Dr. Brandi Thompson Summers is an assistant professor of geography and global metropolitan studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She is also affiliated with the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, and the Center for Race and Gender. Her research examines urban cultural landscapes and the political and economic dynamics by which race and space are reimagined and reordered. She has published several articles and essays that analyze the relationship between race, power, aesthetics, and urbanization that appear in both academic and popular publications, including Washington History. Dr. Summers is the author of Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City, which explores how aesthetics and race converge to locate or map Blackness in Washington, D.C. Dr. Summers received her BA in History from the University of Pennsylvania, her MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago, and earned an MA and a PhD in Sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And she comes to us tonight from Berkeley, California. So there will be time for questions. Please submit those at any point via the Q&A function on Zoom. My colleague MJ Rimsha-Pavlovska, Associate Professor in the Department of History and Director of the Graduate Public History Program at American University, will facilitate that portion of the program. Without further ado.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I think I'm going to be sharing my screen. Hopefully it'll be pretty easy to do so. Yes. And let me start here. Wonderful. All right, welcome everyone. I wish, I wish I could see everyone. It's really awkward to be on a screen, even though I've been living in Zoom University with my students. So I know what it feels like to do this from my home. But I'm truly excited. I'm also nervous to give this lecture this evening, but I do appreciate you joining me. And hopefully we can have a really robust conversation later on after I am done. So first, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank the DC History Center and American University for the work of bringing people together, even online, especially for the conference. I also want to thank Laura Hagen for inviting me to come and to speak. I really appreciate it. Also the conference planning committee, specifically, as Laura mentioned, Marin Orchard, who's been amazing and a pleasure to work with. And I also want to give a special thanks to my friend, the brilliant scholar, Izetta Autumn Mosley, who is just an amazing human being, but also incredibly brilliant. And I'm really grateful for you suggesting me to do this talk tonight. I also want to thank the Brown family for their generosity in lending Dr. Woods Brown's name to this lecture, thereby inviting us to think deeply about her impact and legacy on the study of Black DC. So just actually to start with her, for those of you who don't know much about Dr. Letitia Woods Brown, she came from a long line of educators. As Laura mentioned earlier, she was a Tuskegee Institute alumna whose great-grandfather was one of the institution's founders. Dr. Woods Brown was a world traveler. She had this tenacious appetite for research and education. Despite her PhD in history at Harvard, and she was, now I'm not sure either she was the first or one of the first Black women to achieve her PhD from Harvard in history, but she was also an interdisciplinary scholar. She had a profound impact, from what I understand, on those who encountered her in the classroom and also outside of it until her untimely death at 60 years old in 1976. So we're here today at the DC History Conference, or at your home, wherever you are, organized by the theme Echoes. And in order to think more about the significance of echoes, I wanted to start with something that Dr. Woods Brown said in 1974. She said, "Somehow I am both historian and futurist. One basic question haunts me. What do students need to know about themselves, about the past, that will help them face their world, understanding, and commitment? I suppose I will continue to grapple with it. A growing awareness of the way we organize and present data helps shape the way people think, and how we teach is as important as what we teach and how we feel about what we learn." So for me, this quote perfectly contextualizes this year's conference theme as we think about reading the present through our collective paths. Her words also help me think about the stakes of my own research and how I decide what to share and what to do. Imagining Dr. Woods Brown as both this historian and a futurist really invites us to wonder, how do we understand the world in which we live? Like Dr. Woods Brown, I was a mother living in Washington, D.C. while attempting to finish my dissertation research. It was actually the birth of my daughter, Cameron, that inspired me to finish it. DC wasn't my birthplace. I'm from Oakland, but it was certainly an adopted home for so many years. I was trained as a sociologist, but to be honest with you, as I think, it was really an interest of mine to have a quest to understand this tone and texture of Blackness and the significance of DC that really led me to consider more interdisciplinary methods and theories to investigate this really rich world. So again, that brings me back to the conference theme, Echoes. For me, reading America's present through its past brings up this sense of deja vu, especially if we pause to reflect on the events of the past few months. Despite the interracial coalition of people who organized demonstrations in response to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless African Americans by police officers, it's hard to ignore how the wave of urban race rebellions that have gripped the United States, that did in the 1960s, particularly those led by Black Americans, foretold some of the events unfolding today. The frustration that DC residents experienced in the mid-20th century was part of a national discontent that was felt by Black people over the stagnant progress of the civil rights movement and continuing racial injustices. Overwhelming feelings of isolation and abandonment, they reached their peak in 1968 when Black Washingtonians actively expressed their dismay over the continuing social, political, and economic marginalization, and they took to the streets following the April 4th assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Similar to today, the DC rebellions of 1968 took place amid extreme disparities in economic, educational, and health conditions, excessive policing and tense relationships between Black Washingtonians and the federal government. In its aftermath, however, Black activists, community leaders, including the infamous Marion Barry, residents, business owners, they all hoped to take advantage of what they perceived as a moment of opportunity to have the decimated riot corridors be built and run by Black people. So in October 1968, Howard University trained architect Robert Nash wrote a forceful essay published in the Journal of the American Institute of Architects about the need to recognize Blackness as central to determining the direction and development along the damaged corridors. Blacks, he wrote, are now at the point where it is necessary for them to take massive, collective, objective look at themselves, with Black people doing the defining. Concerning the rebuilding of Washington, Nash observed that Blacks were establishing their own design criteria, a good portion of which dictates who is to do what and when. And those standards included an insistence upon maximum involvement of Blacks, from layman through professional. Nash also called for a recognition of whiteness and its role in the oppression of Black Washingtonians. He said, whites can no longer be paternalistic, stumbling, confused step-parents of Blacks, he warned. Whites have to understand that any role they play in rebuilding and planning for Black ghettos has to be defined by Black people. Certainly, he added, that whites could participate in the process, but he said they no longer can be at the leadership or decision-making levels to which they're so accustomed. So ensuring the planning and the rebuilding of Black neighborhoods remained in Black control, he believed, but one element of the insurance policy against distrust that's mounted over centuries for Black folks. Nash's words were consistent with much of what Black empowerment rhetoric that had begun to surface in the years leading up to the '68 uprisings had happened. In this case, Black Washingtonians were articulating their desire for full-scale change. What they ultimately proposed was the development of a Black sense of place, a city that fostered community and communal survival. In other words, they longed for a chocolate city. Washington, D.C., without a doubt, is a chocolate city. It's the nation's first, in fact. The tone and tenor of Washington, D.C. and its cultural relevance to Black life is almost unparalleled. In 1975, Parliament proclaimed the power of the nation's chocolate cities, where Black people became a clear majority once white residents were drawn out to the suburbs. The concept of a majority Black chocolate city instilled and reflected a sense of pride and hope for the future of a Black city, but it also recognized its limits, like unfulfilled promises from the federal government to Black people, again, to achieve full equality. The chocolate city of the funk era referenced an aesthetic of Black empowerment and nationalism in music, in fashion, in politics, and also visual arts. Chocolate City emphasized Black distinction, separate from a white world. More recently, however, the city has experienced shifts in the global economy and revised commitments by local governments to privilege policies that facilitate the displacement of Black families. Gentrification, along with the displacement of Black people from their homes, is driven by developers, corporations, businesses, and landlords, in addition to the DC government. They turn cheap land into profitable space. So as I see it, understanding gentrification as it operates today is a portal for understanding our past. In so many ways, the rapid gentrification of the 21st century functions as a perfect successor to various forms of systemic inequality from the 20th century in ways that continue to economically marginalize and displace Black people in the city. Trauma, struggle, love, joy, and everyday life makes both the chocolate city visible and patterns of anti-Blackness legible in the face of gentrification and displacement. And this isn't just a feeling. In 2018, the DC Chamber of Commerce documented the influx of white people displacing Black residents. A 2019 study from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition found that DC experienced the greatest intensity of gentrification in the US between 2000 and 2013. Mostly affluent white newcomers displaced more than 20,000 Black residents during that period. For many residents, this really isn't a surprise. This rapid demographic and economic shift has had a profound impact on the physical, cultural, and political memory of Black DC. It's too often obscured. Black Washingtonians now live in space between being too much and having way too little. When I moved to Washington, DC in 2011, I ventured to search for a chocolate city. I was just starting my dissertation research, and I had anticipated examining the work of Blackness on the political activities of a DC-based organization in the wake of President Barack Obama's historic election. As someone who had been to DC several times, and as Laura mentioned, I went to college in Philadelphia, I had partied for Howard's homecoming. I had visited several Smithsonian museums, and I had studied at the Library of Congress. I had listened to go-go blaring from the speakers at Republic Gardens and DC Live. I had even had Sunday brunch a few times at Phillips, hoarding as many rum buns as possible. But I thought I knew about the cultural terrain of this city. I thought this project honestly would write itself. That was until I encountered the 8th Street Northeast corridor for the first time. So for those of you who might not be as familiar, even though I imagine if you're joining this conference, you're interested in DC history and are pretty familiar with it. 8th Street, or at least the 8th Street corridor, now known as the Atlas District, is known as one of the 3 neighborhoods that was devastated by the '68 uprisings. 8th Street is a little over a mile from the Capitol and is one of the few areas where Black Washingtonians could shop until 1954 because segregation policy barred them from shopping downtown. It was a central location for Black social and economic life. 8th Street was the most significant commercial activity center within the greater Capitol Hill East area. In fact, it was second only to downtown in the production of jobs and tax revenue. In the years after the uprisings, the decimated corridor experienced a combination of state and corporate divestment, abandonment, and disparaging representations of urban markets and Black consumers. Following the failure of lukewarm government-led efforts to revive the area, 8th Street was considered hopeless and stagnant by lending institutions, by developers, small business owners, local government officials, and media outlets. For so many years, this Black geography was classified as an imperiled and dangerous space. But despite various efforts to overcome the durable and enduring stain of the '68 uprisings, the subsequent abandonment of the corridor drove down the economic and in many ways cultural value of the neighborhood. This devaluation of the neighborhood was crucial to the creation of multiple opportunities for capital investment and profit generated from private investors purchasing cheap, blighted real estate. Along with an increase in property values, the neighborhood experienced a demographic shift, not only impacted the area's long-term residents, but they also have led to this loss of a Black identity. The local government, in conjunction with planners, developers, and historic preservationists, implemented measures that emphasize both race neutrality and multiculturalism as a way to anchor the space and attract commercial and residential traffic. In addition to the structural implementations that were put in place, a discursive plan was executed at the same time, one that emphasized this early history of 8th Street that avoided meaningful discourse about the recent past. In order to erase the difficult past, historic preservation was used to legitimize the narrative. In light of 8th Street's violent past, the narrative describing this history reinvents itself in order to write the violent times away and repurpose the neighborhood for a new market and for a new time. By all accounts, this was effective. In 2011, 8th Street Northeast was named USA Today's top up-and-coming neighborhood. The next year, in 2012, Forbes magazine ranked H Street #6 on its list of America's hippest hipster neighborhoods. But linked to these designations, there's been this gradual demographic shift in the area's population. Mostly white, upper income residents are returning to the city as products, proliferators, and creators of gentrification. The H Street corridor is not unlike many neighborhoods that have been target for capital reinvestment through various urban policies like public-private partnerships and various public subsidies that go to corporate partners. However, in contrast to those newly redeveloped urban spaces that are advertised as transcending past historical race and class divisions to, welcome social difference, the institutional narratives about the rebranded Atlas District promote the area's cosmopolitanism as a necessary and fundamental feature of its historical roots. Then at the same time, Blackness, perhaps not Black people, remains central. The revised, gentrified landscape of the Atlas District is decidedly urban, but with aesthetic upgrades, as it reflects a coupling of this new economy with new urbanism. Gentrification, as I see it, is this explicitly aesthetic urbanizing process. The aesthetics of gentrification become clear when we look at the built environment. The street has become this place where minimalist monoculture is really popular. There's this aesthetics of locality, placemaking through details like, as you see, exposed brick or repurposed signage, chalkboards, and rust metal. There's this strange mix of retro Americana that ironically signifies a kind of working class authenticity through its presentation of old but new businesses. These aesthetics end up coupling with the systemic devaluation of assets that are critical to low-income people and the revaluing of these same assets for rich folks. Together, they go hand in hand with the emerging ecology of boutiques, of coffee shops, expensive restaurants, and as we know, craft breweries. The aesthetic is definitely anti-corporate, but it signals something welcoming to newcomers as a local and inviting space to discover. The current hyperinvestment in lifestyle amenities has very little to do with simply increasing the value of the space itself. Adding a new cupcake bakery, juice bar, or doggy hotel does not necessarily generate more capital than a hair salon or a local pharmacy, if those still existed. This gentrification today is represented by the visual consumption that's brought on by the aestheticizing of people, of culture, of history, and also of public space. Still, with gentrification has come this continuation of Blackness for profit, an aesthetic form of Blackness that entices white consumers and newcomers. Chocolate City as a metaphor for the circulation of Black culture was at one point fully saturated. Now we're experiencing the shift in the geographic distribution of Black people and an increasing commitment to diversity that is in many ways independent of Black people, yet inclusive of projections of Blackness. It's this post-Chocolate City context and aesthetic that markets a depoliticized Black cool in the multicultural city. The transition of the Chocolate City is not just about an implicit or even an explicit branding of stereotypical representations of Blackness for the pleasure of young white professionals. Instead, it's really this retooling of Blackness to fit into the city's emerging cultural narrative. The grit and danger that's evoked by the mere mention of Blackness doesn't coalesce with the harmonious cultural diversity that the city's success now hinges upon. Even though there's a greater emphasis on the district's increasing diversity, if we look closer, it becomes immediately clear that Black people are being expunged from the city. But the Blackness of their bodies and culture evokes, it makes it seem as though DC is still authentically Black. In my book, I introduced the concept Black aesthetic and placement as a way to think about how Blackness is aestheticized and used to control public space, as well as organize landscapes and generate capital. Black aesthetic and placement incorporates these spatial projections of Blackness that really end up obscuring our recognition of displacement, of containment, and exclusion that's really facilitated by excessive policing, by predatory lending, by evictions, and increased tax burdens that come along with gentrification. So what I find is that there's this strategic incorporation of Blackness as an aesthetic that ends up being essential to gentrification, again, as this urbanizing process. And it can be seen clearly in the institutions that provide us with daily services. So just to give a brief illustration, I'm going to go to one of the most recognized markers of gentrification in the American city, and certainly in Washington, D.C., Whole Foods Market. So there's a Whole Foods on H Street at 6th and H, as there are several in the city. But this one opened up on the ground floor of a luxury residential building on H Street in May of 2017. A few months after the store's grand opening, I walked in and I wanted to look around. And truth be told, I had received a message from a friend and fellow sociologist, Derek Hyra, who mentioned that I ought to stop by the store to kind of see this remarkable site. So I did. And a couple of aisles down from the organic produce section, next to the non-dairy milk products, was this immaculately organized, color-coded display of gourmet chocolates. Chocolate City. Above this multi-tiered tower, as you see, is this framing of Chocolate City. And it was prominently featured, as you see, in white block letters, foregrounding a dark chocolatey brown backdrop. Above the sign, also you can see there's this generic city skyline that's clearly not DC, resembling, paper cutouts dipped in various hues of chocolate brown. So after a few weeks, the store's management team received backlash after images of their Chocolate City went viral on social media. People could not believe that the store would appropriate the name Chocolate City, given the context of the neighborhoods and the city's vanishing population, Black population. As a result, the Chocolate City became Confectioner's Corner. And we got this revised tan and white color scheme. And I didn't get a chance to take a picture of Confectioner's Corner, but boy, I will remember it forever. So even though the Chocolate City of Whole Foods lasted only a few weeks, examples of Black aesthetic and placement like this shed additional light on why the movement of white residents into Black neighborhoods generates tension and really these clear feelings of exclusion. The presence of these racial aesthetics disrupt narratives commonly associated with gentrification, namely displacement. In these neighborhoods that previously had Black majorities, there's this residual Blackness, these traces of Blackness that get carried over into the gentrified spaces. Really, it becomes a model. So the Chocolate City turned Confectioner's Corner ends up exposing how Blackness accrues value that's not necessarily extended to Black people. In other words, Blackness is cool, even and especially when Black folks are not. This kind of Black aesthetic and placement accounts for the active disassociation of Blackness from Black embodiment and its representation in the form of words and images and objects, as well as performances. As this urban aesthetic, Blackness doesn't only rely, again, on the presence of Black people for social traction. Black aesthetic and placement opens up this ability to kind of play, right, with the fluidity and instability of Blackness and capitalism, again, whether Black folks are there or not. The Chocolate City display shows how the store's management team recognizes the importance of the city's cultural geography. However, their decision to use a phrase and symbol for the display that conjures but doesn't confirm Blackness reflects the privilege of whiteness to take Black space and anchor its connection to Blackness for profit. So elite actors and institutions increasingly weaponize the chocolate sights, sounds, and tastes of yesteryear, and they use them to move Black people out of their designated spaces, leading to this tension between cultural aesthetics and aesthetics of anti-Blackness as ornamental. Again, Black aesthetic and placement through this use of representations of Blackness can currently attract white, wealthy folks while repelling longtime Black residents. One other example I can use from my research shows that there's this geographic collision of both the past and the present. In particular, a place that I call the corner, the center of the H Street corridor. So the center of the corridor around 8th and H, and really this longer block between 8th and 10th and H, served as this important juncture from the early to mid 20th century where the commercial cluster developed. Despite the physical changes and the redevelopment efforts that were taking place in the middle of H Street today, the corner was and seems to continue to be a center of activity and a meeting place along the corridor. Speaking about the corner in 2017, Henry, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, Fonvier, I'm doing it the French way, president of Virginia-based developer Rapidly, discussed plans for the company's newest development project on H Street in this BizNow Washington article. Avec, a $201 million mixed-use building that replaced the now demolished H Street Connection strip mall that was built over 30 years ago in the same location. It sits adjacent to the 8th and H intersection, and H Street Connection previously spanned 2 blocks in the center of the corridor where mostly Black city dwellers waited for buses. In comparison to the diversity of races and classes that were found at the eastern and western ends of H Street, this corner, when I was doing my research, and really honestly right before I left DC, is noticeably less heterogeneous, providing clear markers of working class poverty. Although the corner operates as this vital transfer point for public transportation, the sidewalk is used as this form of counter-privatization, in addition to being a place for meaningful social exchange and congregation. When it opened in 1987, H Street Connection was heralded as this centerpiece of redevelopment efforts on H Street, as the neighborhood was still struggling to gain its footing after the 1968 uprisings and the subsequent disinvestment and abandonment by the state that I mentioned earlier. Its grand opening celebration featured the infamous embattled mayor, Marion Barry, city council members, and also 2 marching bands to commemorate the arrival of a local drugstore. While the opening of the H Street Connection marked an important moment in the development of the corridor itself, the construction of Avec signals this brand new era. Most of the H Street Connection stores provided basic services for Black people in the area to replace those that had been previously destroyed or relocated after the uprisings. The intersection of 8th and H is the last relic of the past and from the past, and the changes that are closing in on those who socialize and stake claim there. This corner also ends up being a site that exposes how and where the past and the present day meet. Today, the corner exemplifies where the white spatial imaginary and a Black spatial imaginary overlap. Designated as the central retail and transportation hub of the corridor, the corner and its impending and current transition reflects the ways that both of these spatial imaginaries coexist, right, temporarily. They map onto one another in the same location. The white spatial imaginary ends up being this homogeneous space used for the benefit of investors, tourists, elite consumers, and residents. And here I have a quote from Trent Smith, who is really talking about the really kind of bolstering the reasons why he believed this area on 8th and H needed to be retooled, right? As you see that I've highlighted in red, he's talking about this area being a dead zone where you walk faster to get between the eastern and western ends. And so in reading that commentary, it's pretty clear that he's meaning certain people in terms of who we are, who you are when walking faster past this area. Again, seeing this as a place where no one thrived, despite the fact that it was a bustling transportation point and transfer center for DDOT. So in thinking about the Black spatial imaginary, It's this devalued space that explores the ways in which poor and working class Black people need to use the city. And here I had a conversation with Nizam Ali, who is Ben Ali's son of Ben's Chili Bowl. And he talked about opening up Ben's Chili Bowl on H Street, but in particular, thinking about how familiar 8th and H felt in terms of it being this Black DC. And while there wasn't this kind of positive, negative dichotomy, it's more so thinking about the complexity of the city and how real it felt just to have kind of these elements in the Black city. So back to the Biz Now article, Henry Fonvier, I think that's his name, explained that replacing the strip mall with mixed use development made sense in order to keep up with today's urban taste. He explained that the changing demographics of those moving into the district increases the need to enhance the quality of life for what he says, quote, highly educated professionals, both young and old, that have been moving into the city seeking out an authentic urban lifestyle, end quote. His emphasis on and designation of urban taste, character, and urban lifestyle being authentic, combined with his expressed desire to fulfill the needs of the growing class of new elite residents, creates an even larger division between the incoming white gentry class and the poor Black residents and city dwellers who had started to leave the neighborhood. Incorporating higher price points and limited retail options reflects clear signs of exclusion as new restaurants and bars and boutiques have replaced medical service providers, salons, and laundromats. Fonvier explicitly articulates these changes in the built environment, yet the relationship between urban and Black is undergoing this transformation at the same time that's just as stark and entrenched. Urban is slowly becoming disassociated with a kind of Blackness and is instead a commodity for young, highly educated residents and visitors who want a hip and quirky experience. His comments reflect the idea that lifestyle amenities are understood as needs in this era, signaling authenticities tied to design and design aesthetics that privilege the desires and tastes of the upper class. So despite the hypervisibility of Black bodies on the corner, of Black people, as again, they await their buses, and other locations along the corridor, there's several ways in which Black people, specifically poor and working class Black people, go unseen. To unsee them means that an agent doesn't actively see color or people. It's in their best interest not to see Black people, especially those who are poor or even unhoused. To see them, to envision their lives and the conditions, disrupts this narrative of urban progress. Within the context of urban spaces, seeing is executed by those in power who benefit from it most. Unseeing makes space for elite actors to ignore the needs of those who existed in the space previously and to address those needs. Unseeing involves explicit practices that enable different types of people to exist in the same space without meaningful interaction. Where invisibility speaks to this vanished presence, being unseen is akin to being ignored, and overlooking that ends up being structurally embedded in favor of more aesthetic demands. So unseeing it has this much more significant and specific meaning and application as we think about various spaces of inequality, especially in those cities and neighborhoods where inequalities are racially inflicted. To unsee is more than just this mere refusal to recognize differing political perspectives, but the act of unseeing as this technology in a way structures how people operate in gentrifying spaces, meaning unseeing operates as this external rather than intrinsic device that helps us navigate these geographies upon which we live. Both seen and unseen landscapes exist and together, they map onto one another and they produce their own subjects. But to unsee ends up being this rejection of what lies beneath, namely institutional racism and making connections between structural inequality and policy. Unseeing also effectively secures secures the spatial privileges of whiteness and reflects a white spatial imaginary, which encourages developers to focus their efforts on the growing number of affluent, educated people returning to DC, rather than those poor and working class residents that are still there and have not necessarily been displaced from the area. The unseen are constitutively excluded from planning processes and development as well, even though they're ever present, felt, and especially unaccounted for. While the corner operates as a space of the unseen, those who congregate on the corner are not invisible. People on the corner are certainly visible to those who drive, walk, or ride by the intersection. In fact, they're a necessary urban fixture that signals the thriving diversity of the area. Visible but not seen, or excuse me, visible but unseen forms of Black working classness and poverty around the corner organize how public space is managed on H Street and how diversity ends up structuring neighborhood development, but specifically how Black subjects are produced through this process. So a few blocks down from 8th and H, between 11th and 12th Street, there was this light post that was tagged with a politically charged message about H Street's rapid change. It says a gentrified DC, and there's a hashtag, I will not be moved DC. This statement, as you see, was spray painted in red in the form of DC's iconic stars and bars flag, with the image of a cassette tape hovering above, as you can see. When I walked by one day, the light post was flanked by an unhoused couple, a Black man and Black woman. And I ended up striking up a conversation on this. It was a really warm day, I remember, with the pair. And the woman in particular shared her desire to move back to Virginia Beach, where she was from, because DC had become unlivable. The woman carried, but had put down, as you can see, a reusable bag from Lululemon, which typically has store locations like in posh neighborhoods like Georgetown. So on this warm Thursday evening in July, young passersby strolled down the corridor in intimate proximity to the street dwellers and me without any regard, even as this unhoused couple gazed in their direction. It was a really uncomfortable and startling scene to witness. This experience then led me to wonder whether it's possible to design a streetscape that is welcoming to the poor and homeless, as well as these new urban tourists and residents. Given the ways that the state and private developers organize the space in order to privilege more affluent visitors, the design and organization of the street demonstrates that this might not be possible. Public spaces, especially in urban locales, are specifically designed and structured to minimize unpleasant encounters and maintain this veneer of unity. While it's true that the poor and homeless are not explicitly ushered off the street necessarily, they're not made to feel welcome as reflected by the design of the street and the order of the built environment. There are a few places for them to sit and really be, right? None of the development projects really have been constructed or those slated to be built provide spaces for them to sit. The retooling of Blackness as a part of the diversity strategy makes it seem as though differently raced, classed, and gendered bodies provides this way to even look at the meaningful interaction, even when it's not. So to be clear, within the context of urban development and spatial reorganization, it's Black people, it's Black humanity, and the needs of the Black poor and working class residents that go unseen and ignored. Nevertheless, it's these Black bodies that are ever present and hypervisible. Unseeing is this appraisal of what aspects of Blackness that the state, private developers, business owners, tourists, and residents want to keep and use and fold into this narrative of H Street as a destination. Therefore, what's seen through Black aesthetic and placement are these exceptional and iconic representations of Black life, those nostalgic, successful expressions of Blackness, but not necessarily the mundane, quotidian forms of Black life. Around the city, One can witness representations of Black people gradually incorporated into stock images for new building advertisements and strategic planning materials, but with very little regard for the experiences of those who are already present. So on H Street, revitalization opens up the neighborhood to transition from a container of deviancy to this corridor that links economic engines to society. The incorporation of race into the spatial dynamics of the city is the organizing idea through which unequal and uneven development takes place, rather than the results of this development. And DC even attempts to make race less salient and more neutral in these environments, demonstrate clear processes of racialization in which cultural narratives about the rise, the fall, and the resurrection of the historic commercial corridor dominate strategies for how the space is to be developed. So as I wind down, I want to make clear that gentrification, residential and commercial revitalization, and large-scale development undoubtedly create conditions for the displacement of older and poorer Black residents especially, as well as small Black businesses. While Washington, D.C. was the first chocolate city, it's analogous to so many other cities that experienced racism, segregation, high unemployment, and disproportionate incarceration rates, but also this prolific music and food culture, politics, and fun. As I see it, the transition of H Street really exemplifies the dismantling of a Black city, a disappearing mode of social and cultural life that's been revised and remade by an aesthetic infrastructure. But as we look to the future, it's vital that we continue to imagine the ways that Black people make the city in various contexts. The importance of a place like DC is not simply a migration story or even the diverse experiences of Black people, but that Black people built the city in meaningful ways. What this also requires is a customization as a tool of invention. The city's got to contend with how we make ourselves. We have to change the narrative so Black people are not trying to fit in, but instead invent. We have to continue to call out the ways that the violence of gentrification and displacement disproportionately impact Black Washingtonians and allow us to imagine new ways to take up space, to expand and potentially grow. Black life, Black experience, and Black ways of seeing in this chocolate city matter. Despite the dispossession and displacement of Black people in these cities, multiple cities, Blackness leaves an indelible mark on the space, even after Black people leave. So if you'll allow me to quickly return briefly to Dr. Woods Brown's provocation, how we can both be historians and futurists. I ultimately, want to emphasize that despite the continuing impact of gentrification on DC, especially on Black DC, it's these traces of a chocolate city, these echoes of the past that remain temporally and spatially significant as resistant, radical, and imaginative in the face of oppression. So I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with the rest of you, and also wanted to leave open some space to ask questions, to have commentary, and also to speak about experiences in the city. But for now, thank you so much for listening. Oh, you're on mute.
Somebody had to do it. I'm hopefully that's the only time. I'm MJ Rimsha-Pavlovska. I'm the director of the public history program at AU. I'm honored to get to be the moderator for this conversation. So I already see some terrific questions in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is just sort of read the questions out loud to Dr. Summers. But also if I see, so you see there are little thumbs up. If you see questions there too that are close to a question that you were interested in asking yourself, perhaps you could feel free to hit the thumbs up button as well. But yeah, and I might try to synthesize questions that sort of sound similar. So I'm going to do the best I can, basically. So our first question is from an anonymous attendee. So the question is, I wonder if you've seen Residue, which is a movie by a DC native about gentrification in Eckington, and whether you feel that the cinematic representation of the displacement that you described matches with what you've observed. I wonder if I could even extend that a little bit and ask how, yeah, so your case study is very much about H Street, although it clearly maps onto so many other parts of DC. So I wonder if you can address what that looks like in Eckington and other places.
So first of all, thank you for that question. I love Residue. I've seen it 3 times and I just can't get enough. I think, you know, I every talk I've given since since I've watched it, I just gush about how amazing the film is. Now, and I'll tell you why. I think that, you know, most recently there have been so many films about race, about urban change, really trying to document history and understand, in some ways, what gentrification may feel like, right? I think this film does it expertly. There's an affective dimension. You can feel it, right? And some of the choices, the stylistic choices, for example, to not show the faces for very long of the gentrifiers, to really kind of pan in on the bodies and faces of the characters who are in Eckington. It's beautiful. And then on top of that, I think it does what some films can't. So I might get panned for this, but the film that was really popular was The Last Black Man in San Francisco, and talking about, in a lot of ways, gentrification in San Francisco, but so much more. And I think that Residue does something that The Last Black Man in San Francisco doesn't. You literally feel it, like it's heart-wrenching. The emotion comes through. And I think it really does speak to this texture that I was talking about of Blackness that exists and has existed in Washington, D.C., that is really being dismantled, but there's still opportunity for it to be built up again. And so the other element I'd say about why the film was so good to me is because it really focuses on something that I care about, which is kind of this everyday quotidian element of Blackness, of Black life. And so that's one of the reasons why I didn't choose to do work on Shaw or the U Street, 14th and U area, because those were more well-known Black areas like the Black Broadway, or thinking about Howard University and Shaw. It has this really kind of iconic and exceptional representation of Blackness as being successful in a lot of ways, right? Entertainment corridors. Whereas with H Street and Eckington being not too far away, there is this sense that this is just everyday Black life, subsistence. Like these are the ways that Black people live every day. And I think that in order for us to make real change, we have to account for that life, not necessarily the entertainment life, but just how to get basic needs met, how to get an affordable grocery store, in terms of transportation. And I see there's a question about the streetcar. I can get into that, but not necessarily having transportation projects that don't go anywhere. I'll save my comments for that question. But it's fantastic. So if you haven't seen the film, see it, watch it. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it, because I just adore. I cried, I laughed, it was all the emotions. So it's fantastic, fantastic. Oh, yeah.
The second, I'm going to stop. So actually, the streetcar question, so this is Flanora Merritt asks, when examining gentrification in DC, did you come across, oh wait, nope, never mind. That's the third question. Sorry about that. Margaret Ballard asks, do you view the streetcar project as a thorn or a positive impetus to the H Street corridor?
Yeah, and I do talk about that in my book a little bit. So I don't know. I want to try to avoid positive, negative binary. And I want to say that in a lot of ways, it's buying into this branding of the Atlas District, in that there's a focus on the nostalgic elements about the streetcar being something that existed in the past. And what we should know also is that the year the streetcar ended in the 20th century was the year that the area became majority Black. And so I don't think that that's an accident. And also, and not to say again that there are some like evil, you know, racist folks who are waiting to kind of dismantle Black life in DC, at least in the mid 20th century. But I do think it had to do with this slow disinvestment of the area. And so as we're thinking about transportation infrastructure, there already is a robust transportation infrastructure on H Street. It was the highest bus transfer point in the city. And so the route of the streetcar goes the same route as the X2. So it doesn't, it's kind of like it overdetermines the space. It's not necessary. And in terms of its impact, there were so many years that it was disruptive, specifically to Black businesses. I mean, I interviewed some owners of beauty shops who talked about how disruptive it was to their businesses because of how the construction tore up the street, right? And so for those of you who are familiar with Black beauty shops, it takes a while, like at least a couple of hours. And so if you can't park, not only can you not park in front of the establishment, but you can't park in the neighborhoods because they have the signs that only allow you to park for 2 hours before you're ticketed, right? And then we had performance-based parking going on. So what it does is for those consumers that were coming from Maryland or Virginia, they wouldn't come any longer. So that's disrupting this business landscape. So I think if we're going to think about the streetcar, we have to imagine the kind of ripple effect that it's having on the neighborhood, that it's not just about taking people up and down a 2-mile stretch, that it's had this impact on the landscape, and particularly of Black businesses and Black residents in the area.
Thank you. So I'm going to combine, I have 2 questions I'm going to combine next because I think so Flanora Merritt asks, when examining gentrification in DC, did you come across any activists who are fighting against it? And then further down, Elizabeth Emerson asks, has Dr. Summers met with any district government leaders or anyone from district Office of Planning to review any of the issues raised? So I guess this is about, who are you in conversation with, or who have you been in conversation with?
Sure. So what I'll tell you, one of the limitations of the work, and I'll readily admit, is that I didn't get to talk about activism against gentrification. Yes, there are so many. Empower DC, there's One DC, there's so many organizations that are specifically targeting residential displacement of not just Black Washingtonians, but really thinking about poor and working class DC residents who are being pushed out of the city. So there are absolutely folks who are doing incredible work that are attempting to really make these issues shine, so the DC government and developers and others can really be considerate of how these policies are impacting people. Well, I didn't get to talk about that in a lot of ways. And, I talked to my students about this in preparing a book. You might have an idea of what you're going to get to do until you actually start writing it. And then you realize you have to, oh, wait, I have to talk about this. Oh, I have to talk about that. And you need to give context and detail. And so as it related to resistance, I was like, you know what, that's just going to have to be the next book. I really needed to focus on how inequalities were structured and how these aesthetics of Blackness were really impacting this transmission of inequality that was being perpetuated. So yeah. And the question about folks in planning. So not recently, I haven't talked to officials recently. I did when I was writing originally my dissertation. I did speak to some officials, and it was more to gather information. It wasn't to give them any kind of solutions, right? I think what often happens, and I say this pretty regularly, that sociologists should not be policy people. And so too often we try to give prescriptions, and I don't know that we do a good job. And so what I am here for is to kind of lay out what's going on so policy experts, people can produce legislation, of course, in conversation, that takes into account these elements. I think so often city leaders are really focused on growing the city and some kind of just like rampant explosion in terms of economic development. And they have to take seriously who's going to be impacted by that most. And so in this case, it is poor working class Black folks who had lived in the city are being impacted by these intentions, right? So on the one hand, there might be this emphasis on affordable housing, but if you're not creating not only this residential and business landscape for people to stay, then what's the point? Making the place pretty isn't necessarily going to allow folks to stay in their homes. So no, I haven't talked to them. I don't know that they want to talk to me because I'm so critical, but at the same time, I don't think that it's intentional. I don't think that they're trying to push people out of the city. I think they're trying to do what most cities are trying to do, which is grow, which is be successful, which is be profitable. And the challenge for DC in particular is how much land is federal land. So the city has to find ways to generate revenue. And so that ends up being a really complicated position because, DC is less than 10 square miles. So there's not a lot of space. And then with the building, the height restrictions in the buildings, you just see this continual cycle of building, then destruction, and then building all over again. That seems to be kind of the only option there. So no, I don't know if they want to talk to me.
Thank you. And actually, so two things really quickly. One is that Dr. Mobley has put in the chat links to both Empower DC and One DC. So if you're interested in finding out, as well as to the film Residue. So if you're interested in finding out more about either of these organizations or this film, you have the resources right there, as well as links to Dr. Summers' book. That's a little bit farther up. The next question actually is Sid, you kind of already started answering it. This is from anonymous attendee. What recommendations do you have for architects who are designing new or renovating existing buildings in DC in order to support the themes of your presentation?
Yeah, I just talked to this morning, I was talking to an architecture class. It's funny. So I think, how do I best answer this question? I think it's important to understand context. I think, unfortunately, with architecture, in terms of the discipline, and therefore architects, as well as planning, urban planning, city planning, and planners, that oftentimes what the theories that hold these disciplines and practices together don't account for expertise outside of themselves, right? So the assumption is that they're the experts who are supposed to come in and tell you how you should essentially use space. And so I think when it relates to architects, because it's not just architects, right? There are people who want to renovate spaces, not to live in them in some cases, but for the most part, they want investment property. And so I think it's understanding kind of the motivation behind why you're transitioning a particular structure. But then at the same time, again, it's understanding the context under which you were able to come in and do that work. And so it's a matter of being more cognizant and being more patient around understanding, honestly, like where you're going, where you are deciding to live. Ask yourself these questions. Why am I deciding to live in this neighborhood? Is it that, or again, am I deciding to live in this neighborhood, or am I only doing this for an investment project? Is it because it's a nice neighborhood where, maybe I want to, raise my family, or maybe it's a place where I just want to be for a few years and I want to make some money off of it? Understand that this is an ecosystem that you're walking into, that it's not just you walking in and, transitioning one place. Understand the full ecosystem and how you're affecting it. So what I would encourage you to think about are ways that every one of these buildings, especially in DC, has unique character. And one of the, I'd say the downfall of gentrification in this aesthetic way is that everything starts to look the same. So I'd imagine that, you start to think about the opportunities to remain its distinct character, or maybe not do these transitions at all, and really rethink your motivation behind why you're there and whether you plan to stay.
Great. So the next is also related. This is from Adina Norwood. What is the next step for the next generation of DC natives?
Oh my. What's the next step? So I'm guessing that's like, what should they do? So lately I've been thinking, even though my research has transitioned to focusing on Oakland, I had recently been paying attention to what had been going on with the Don't Mute DC movement. And that was last year and has continued under incredible leadership. And honestly, I think the next generation of DC natives needs to stay. I'm really interested in how we account for a politics of staying. How do you get to stay where you live, right? How do you get to stay in a place and not be, thought to be a trespasser, loiterer, et cetera? And so one way of doing that in terms of cultural production, honestly, I think is go-go music. And so there are ways that I think the Don't Mute DC movement has been really effective, or especially was when I was still there, and that it brought people to the streets. It brought people to take over space again, because there have been so many times when they've been pushed and told that they can't be. So learn to find ways to take your space again. And part of that requires getting involved in local government, right? And that doesn't mean you have to be a politician. It just means holding your leaders accountable. It means focusing on your neighborhood and knowing when you need to speak up. I think as a city as a whole sometimes can be overwhelming to determine what to do, but a way to stay is for you knowing what's in your neighborhood and being very clear about how you should stay, how your family should stay. And I'm using the term stay purposefully, not own, right? Because sometimes we don't have the capital to own. Stay. And instead, it allows you to kind of have this investment in your community that you've had for so long because you're a native Washingtonian. So think about what those politics are, what the stakes are for you to stay.
I'm going to read out loud the next one from Katharina Herring. I enjoyed your talk, Dr. Summers. Could you please comment on the significance of the Children's Museum, which used to be in the old Little Sisters of the Poor House on 8th Street, of course, for the neighborhood? So how did the closing of the site affect the gentrification of the 8th Street corridor?
Yeah, so I did talk about Children's Museum in the book a little bit, because it was one of the first buildings that was transitioned just in terms of this huge wave, right? So 8th Street's not literally cut up, but in a way that it's marketed as having kind of these three distinct areas around like the residential area. There's the commercial area in terms of like, again, stores where you can get your needs met. And then there's the entertainment area. And so where the Children's Museum, which like you said, used to be Little Sisters of the Poor House, that building was taken over by Jim Abdo's real estate company. And it basically created a place for young, in a lot of cases, single people who were close, who either worked on the Hill or close enough to it to start venturing out and exploring other parts of the city. What I also talk about in the book is the fact that, where the 8th Street Bridge is, because, the building kind of sits right at the base of the bridge, how there was this visual obstruction produced by the way the bridge was constructed. And so there's this way that that structure itself provided some kind of invitation that prevented you from really feeling like there was this visual block, right, between downtown and 8th Street. So I definitely think that the conversion of that building, as well as the restaurants and bars and other entertainment venues that Joe Englert started on 8th Street, were really kind of like, it blew everything up. It's really what started that mass change on 8th Street.
So all the questions, I can tell this is a real DC audience, because all the questions that are getting upvoted are the questions that are about really particular DC places. So I'll just go through some of these. Do you see Deanwood going the same way as 8th Street with gentrification? And this is from Andrew Sager.
So the interesting thing about, like, if you talk to urban studies folks and they look at maps around areas that can be gentrified, right? If we think about the value of the land and the homes that are on it and whether they can be transitioned so that gentrification actually occurs. They say that in Ward 7 and Ward 8, gentrification basically can't happen, that there can't be this reversal or at least this huge spike in the value of the land. As it relates to Deanwood, it's an interesting question. DC is so segregated still, where 95+% of Ward 7 and 8 are still Black. And so it would take a whole lot longer, right? We have this body of water that's separating those two wards from the other wards in the city. And so I think that with this kind of geographic separation, that it would be a lot slower as this transition is occurring. You do start to see the ways in which the city is starting to encourage developers, specifically local business owners, to participate in the transition of the area. Like I think Deanwood is a main street, right? So they're trying to find ways to, again, grow economically. But I think, of course, part of the problem ends up being just a focus on economic development and not necessarily focusing on city services, making sure the garbage collectors come. If you think about all of the federal land, also like the parks, right, in Ward 7 and Ward 8, the fact that those are federally run, but so often they are not clean like they are along the Potomac, right? That's not, or as they are in Rock Creek Park. So I think there are these ways that the neglect will continue, even though it's an area that would seemingly be primed or ripe for gentrification. I think it's going to be really slow and it's not going to happen in the same way.
So here's another one from James. How does Hechinger Mall, built in the early 80s in the 1300 block of Benning Road, fit into an upscale 8th Street corridor?
Right. Yeah. So there are intentions to basically extend not only the streetcar, but also just kind of the corridor itself all the way down to Benning, and really get to the 295. I would love to see how that's going to happen. There's going to have to be, I mean, I'm being sarcastic. There has to be tremendous upheaval. And so it's kind of as if Hechinger represents the old H Street, right? Where you have these kind of flagship stores that are there. It's like it was the largest Safeway in the country that was there, right? And so there's an Aldi right nearby. So right now, there are stores there that serve a particular purpose for more working class Black people who live in that neighborhood. But as we know, in the Trinidad area, it's changing dramatically. And so I really do believe in the next 5 years that plaza is either not going to be there, it's going to go the way of H Street connection, or there's going to be this retooling and there's going to be a way in which it's siphoned out, like the value is siphoned out so that those stores can't remain. I imagine that kind of seeing the impact of COVID can accelerate these kinds of changes depending on how it's handled essentially by the city. But yeah, Hechinger certainly represents that older model, that older H Street.
There's a question that I saw that's sort of way at the bottom, but it's so this is from Kate Denson. Dr. Summers, thank you. Can you talk about how Black churches, new white churches, and other religious spaces are working on 8th Street Northeast?
Yeah, so there's not as many, like, you know how there are several Black churches. Well, first, I don't talk about Black church. I don't talk about churches in the book, really. I think there are some scholars who do really great work with that, especially in thinking about where they're located. And you know how with a lot of the Black churches, there was a way of parking where you could park vertically instead, right? Yes, instead of horizontally on the street, only on Sundays. And so you were finding that, especially in Northwest, that there are new residents who are coming in and complaining about the congestion of the cars that, again, are only there on Sundays. So on H Street, there isn't that same kind of issue. And I'm forgetting, of course, that large church that's on H is it like 10th or 9th? Anyway, that's where there would be a ton of meetings, actually. That's where I would often go to meetings, like whether it be meetings from the Department of DempEd, the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, or other types of organizations would, yes, Cavalry Episcopal, exactly. There were a ton of meetings that were there. So you didn't kind of see that same, it was as if they were participating in a lot of the activities in the neighborhood. We also have to imagine like where the farmers markets were, right? And so there's a way that the churches are trying to find ways to maintain themselves, or at least remain in the space, by participating in a lot of the civic activities that were taking place. But they're not having, or at least I didn't find they were having the same issues that several of them in Northwest were having, where again, they're their parishioners were coming from Prince George's County possibly and not able to park in the neighborhood because of complaints from residents nearby.
I knew it was only a matter of time before someone popped into chat with the name of the church.
Yes, thank you.
So this one's from Ellen Kessler. This is both an informational and a sort of another question about specific geography of the H Street area. So what are the demographics of the neighborhood in terms of racial breakdown? And do you think that the addition of the Giant is a plus? There wasn't a big grocery store before.
So I had a slide that showed where the breakdown is now. And so it's almost even, or at least the white population has overtaken the Black population now, but it was like this graph that did this, right? So, or it did this. And so the projections are seeing a larger white population over a Black population in the coming 5 years, right? And so in terms of the Giant arriving, the Giant arrived around the same time as the Whole Foods. The thing is, there was a basic grocery store there. There was a Murray's there. And prior to Murray's, there was a Safeway. And so, I think that there's this way that we talk about food deserts or neighborhoods that don't have access to healthy, good food. But actually, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, where there have been several attempts, especially for Black shop owners, to have grocery stores to provide those kinds of goods for the residents. But in a lot of ways, they didn't get the same kind of capital and support from the city in order to remain. So again, there were grocery stores, right? And then also even thinking about Heckinger Mall, there was a Safeway right at the end of the corridor. So it wasn't necessary, right? If we think about other areas of the city that don't have grocery stores, and certainly not large grocery stores like that Giant, or don't have, again, access to food. Like if we recall what happened with the Walmarts not showing up, and I think there were 7 that were supposed to be built, they didn't show up, right? And so there are plenty of neighborhoods in Ward 7 and Ward 8 that don't have access to Giants like that. They have to cross into the Maryland border in order to go to the grocery store. So I think what was significant though about the Giant and the Whole Foods coming to H Street is that the Safeway and the Murray's and the Safeway before it, there's actual spaces, the parking lot served as this kind of cultural environment for folks, whether it be to play dominoes or cards or just to sit and socialize. And that's what's gone, right? And so when I talked earlier about ecosystems, it's like these businesses also contribute to the residential movement of folks, like how people are connecting to their communities. So it's not, again, just about providing good food. In this way, I think with Giant, they probably saw where they could have there's a good market, right? There's a growing population. They could probably have more people go there, despite the fact that it's only a couple of blocks down from the Whole Foods.
So this next one is from an anonymous attendee. Can redevelopment exist without displacing long-term DC residents?
Yeah, so, I mean, development has it has such a bad rap now that the way it is set up, no, right? So we have to really kind of reimagine what we mean by redevelopment. Are we taking spaces that are functional, spaces that are being used in particular ways, that are being supported by community members, and then deciding that they ought to be obsolete in order to, again, generate more revenue? I think there's got to be a way to engage a more conscious form of development where you're actually helping people continue to use spaces as they do and not determine how they should use spaces. Even looking at data, like this desire to do mixed income and mixed use buildings does not benefit poor people. And especially if you tear down, let's say, public housing units, and we could talk, well, I'm not gonna invite that, but we could talk about a lot of the public housing units that have been torn down and this promise that's been given to the people who lived there previously that only a certain percentage can come back. But once they do come back, their neighborhoods aren't the same. They don't have the same amenities, they don't have the same neighbors, and they can't kind of create that same neighborhood fabric. So as it relates to redevelopment, it's a matter of like, what are we doing? How are we impacting this entire environment? Just because you're putting in a grocery store doesn't mean you're necessarily helping the community. Just because you're putting in, I don't know, a gas station, a dry cleaners, think about the impact overall. Think about the ways that the government is providing subsidies to these big corporations to put these new buildings down, but not necessarily considering the needs of the actual public. The job of the developers is to convince people that it's a good idea. They're not going in and asking them what they want.
So we only have about 6 minutes left, and there's so many great questions. I'm going to go. So there's the next one is from Susan Garfinkel, and it's been up for a while. I'm not going to read the entire thing because it sounds better when you read it anyway. But the main question is about the relationship between commercial and sort of residential, the interrelationship of residential gentrification and the commercial gentrification that you talked about today. So how do those two work together?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, so I purposely didn't focus my analysis on residential gentrification. I really felt like there was some good work out there being done on residential gentrification in DC, not necessarily in the neighborhood, in the H Street corridor area. But to be honest with you, I think they have to go together, because you're thinking about these communities that are built, these residential communities that are built, and then the commercial areas that are built for them, right? And so in a lot of ways, previously, before everyone was zipping and driving 100 miles to go to work, you stayed within your neighborhood. So it made sense for the commercial corridor to match the needs of the people in the neighborhood. Now people move to different parts of the city and exist in different parts. And so these businesses are not necessarily trying to attract nearby people, but instead they're trying to attract people from far away, from outside the city, from outside the country even, right? And so I think part of the, the rising costs of housing in DC, and mind you, I live in the Bay Area, so I understand what this means in terms of the rising costs. I mean, it's unlivable here. You can't, it's pretty much unlivable. And so DC is becoming that way. And so I think that, I didn't get to talk about it today, but yes, these architectural features that are added to these old Victorian homes, the different, painting stone or painting brick now, again, the gentrification gray, all those things help contribute to this elevation, or at least producing this very static way of seeing kind of what neutral or neutrality. I can imagine myself in this space because it's so neutral, right? It's trying to take away from that character that we've gotten so used to in DC, but it's not just the aesthetic upgrades that are causing this the rise in property values. It's a whole host of other elements that I think are really important to think about, these structural elements that are impacting, again, how folks get to paint gray buildings all the time. I do think that, last thing I'll say is, it's a lot about neighborhood feel. And so that's, again, why I focused on this commercial element, because, again, let's say you're someone whose building is torn down, but then you're invited to come back once it's rebuilt. If you don't feel comfortable going into the space where you live around, you're not going to want to stay there for very long. You build all of these relationships and have all of these connections with people over time, and then in a moment it's gone. And I think that also kind of plays out in terms of neighborhood businesses. If you're used to seeing the same shopkeeper, you have a level of comfort with them. That isn't the case anymore. And that's not necessarily unique to DC. That's literally like how our economy works today. And again, there's ways that urban can in a lot of ways mean, ephemeral. People don't stay in urban places, or at least newcomers with wealth don't stay in urban places. A lot of the folks I interviewed had full intention of buying a home around H Street and leaving within 5 years once they started their families. There's not an intention in investing in the area like it used to be. So it's complicated, but they're totally related in terms of how they kind of play out and still contribute to the displacement of people who don't have the means.
I think we have time for just about one more. I know you probably have not had time to keep an eye on the Q&A, but if there are any that kind of, or from the chat that have popped out at you.
Oh gosh, yeah, see, I'm a slow reader. Okay. Man, there's some,
sorry.
Do you see one? No, we answered this one.
I saw one about the impact of the H Street Festival. So the leader, Anwar Salim, and I saw that mentioned. I saw him mentioned in a couple of questions. So I thought maybe that might be one. Yeah. So what's been the impact of the H Street Festival? Their organization's leader, Anwar, is a longtime Washingtonian. How do you see them trying to bridge the old and the new on H Street? And so that was from Kate Benson.
Yeah. So I think So the H Street Festival, as Anwar has said, brings in more traffic and more applications, leasing applications than any other event in the city or at the time of the year. So every September, there's an influx of leasing or applications to rent apartments on H Street after the festival, because it's seen as this really welcoming space. And also kind of like you put your best foot forward in those moments. So I acknowledge, yes, Anwar specifically being a long time, first a Washingtonian, also a native kind of area to the area. He's a business owner along the corridor, owning several beauty shops and other businesses, and certainly being like a huge advocate for the area. The one area where I do say that, or at least I have some contentious elements with Anwar, is more so this emphasis on growth in terms of, as he was quoted in the, there was an article, or maybe it was an interview, where he talked about how Black businesses should essentially behave like white businesses, find ways to be successful in those kinds of elements. And so partly I'm having an issue with the assumption that there needs to be a behavioral change for Black businesses in order to be successful, when it's not behavioral. Those aren't the reasons why Black businesses aren't successful. So if we're inviting a number of more affluent people to come into a neighborhood who have power to change the neighborhood, it's not going to matter how you change, your clientele at your barbershop or beauty shop. There's nothing you can do. And so inviting a different clientele, inviting different residents with more wealth, and again, a different ethnic background, is going to impact the racial landscape. That does not mean that activists aren't actively trying to make sure that there's equity brought to the neighborhood, but even their interest in economic growth might be pushing the people that they care about out. Right? And so looking over time, I think as individuals, and that's why I focused on One DC and on Empower DC, they are looking at this kind of larger phenomenon of wide scale displacement, that is not necessarily just based on a particular neighborhood, but is understanding how to target policy, how to target these actions that the city's taking to bolster the impact of developers. And that's not necessarily something that I'm seeing happen specifically with Anwar. And again, it's not personal, it's just I didn't find that in my work.
Okay. All right. Well, sadly, this brings us to an end. This was just an incredible program, so thought-provoking and engaging and meaningful and profound. Dr. Simmons, I really want to thank you for joining us this evening and sharing your work and research with us. And MJ, thank you for doing such an amazing job of facilitating the questions. It's much harder than it looks. And to all of you who came this evening to join us for this program, thank you so much for doing that. And also, one of the things that we're learning is how the online format really allows us to engage and exchange in really meaningful and interesting ways. So all of you who submitted a chat or a question or a Q&A or a comment or a personal experience, thank you for sharing that with us. And it really enriches all of our experiences to hear from you. So please tune in tomorrow morning for the opening plenary, which will feature, as I mentioned earlier, the Anacostia Community Museum Director, Dr. Melanie Adams, in conversation with Dr. Izetta Autumn-Mobley. I think that will be similarly very, very interesting and something we're all going to want to hear and absorb and pay attention to. Remember that you will use the same link that you used to join us this evening. And with all that said, see you tomorrow.